Right, so welcome back everyone to the IHR seminar in European History 1500-1800. It's the 21st of November 2022, and we have a wonderful mixed session today on the social and cultural history and political history of acrobats between Italy and the Ottoman Empire. I'll actually take a little longer than usual to introduce our speaker and the two respondents, because I think it's really interesting how their works, their research projects speak to each other. Thibaut Rolley is Associate Professor of Early Modern French Studies at the School of European Languages, Culture and Society at University College London. So it's actually a colleague of mine here. He's a scholar of early modern French and comparative literature, whose work benefits from the combination of multiple perspectives and methods, including intellectual history, the history of science, witchcraft studies, and so on. His first book, Élévation, which was published in 2011 by Rosa, it's a beautiful product that I hold as a sort of temporary. He lent it to me, and I still haven't given it back.
It's a gift.
Well, it was not meant to be a gift. But here it is. It's remained in my office ever since, maybe 6 years or so. It's a absolutely wonderful book. It fetched a prestigious prize in France, and it is a path-breaking study of flight and air travel in the Renaissance and the representations of that, of course. Because it is still only available in French, I would like to really point out it's important for a number of subfields that many of us here in the room share, namely the study of the cosmographical revolution and its effects on conceptions of space and travel, the study of early cultural relativism, the study of discourses on intellectual curiosity, the study of demonology and witchcraft, and the ways in which theories of allegory, verisimilitude, and the marvelous can be used to further our understanding of all these things, and in fact of all things living in the early modern period at the intersection between fact and fiction. Thibaut's second book, titled Moi, Louis Gaufridi, ayant soufflé plus de 1000 femmes, une confession de sorcier au XVIIe siècle, should be coming out with Les Belles Lettres before the end of the year. Is that the promise?
I think just after the end of the year.
Soon enough. We hope, of course, there will be an English translation. As for Thibaut's latest project on jugglers, street performers, and acrobats, it has earned Thibaut a prestigious Livium grant. It is all quite fresh, and we have the privilege today of being among the first people to hear more about it, as it is the subject of the talk today. Our two respondents, commentators, are Rosa Salzberg and Sinem Casale. Rosa Salzberg is Associate Professor of Early Modern History in the Department of Sociology and Social Research at Trento in Italy. She has previously taught at Warwick and Melbourne. She has published quite widely already on the social and cultural history of Italian cities and people. I can't really sum it up otherwise. I would mention here a recent special issue of the Journal of Early Modern History on cities in motion, mobility and urban space in early modern Europe, co-edited with Luca Zenobi and Pablo González Martín. And of course, her book, Ephemeral City, Cheap Print and Urban Culture in Renaissance Venice, Manchester University Press, 2014. I was meant to go to see a Manchester United women's match yesterday with my daughter, but it was rescheduled, hence the slippage. She's bringing out a book soon with Cambridge Elements on the Renaissance on the Road. Very exciting title there, and also Connected Mobilities in the Early Modern World, co-edited with Paul Nallis at Amsterdam University Press, to come out soon. Sinem Casale is currently scientific assistant to the director at the Kunsthistorisches Institute in Florence, after having taught in the Department of Art History at the University of Minnesota and McGill University's Institute of Islamic Studies. She specializes in Islamic art and architecture, with an emphasis on the history and visual culture of the Ottomans, Safavids, and Mughals. Her work centers on the relationship between art, diplomacy, religion, and trade in the early modern Muslim world, including material encounters, gift-giving practices, courtly rituals, and theories of the image. Sinem's current book project, Gifts in Motion, Cross-Cultural Exchange in the Early Modern Islamic World, is coming out with Chicago University Press in April 2023. It is the first systematic study to examine relations between the rival courts of the Ottoman and Safavid from the perspective of visual and material culture. And we hope to hear more about it sometime soon, as we will perhaps host a session here in the seminar just on that, but we haven't really finalized the details, and we have to speak about this in more detail. So it's my great pleasure to have it's our privilege to have these three scholars working at on such sort of intersecting issues here. Thibaut did not pre-circulate his paper, but we expect sort of informal comments from our two respondents, and then we'll open it to Q&A as usual. And the session, we should try to conclude the session within an hour and a half or less, if possible. All right, Thibaut, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Zoltan. Thank you very much for inviting me to the European History Seminar. Thank you very much for organizing this session, and I'm very happy to have two respondents, and so many thanks to Rosa and Sinem as well for agreeing to comment on my paper and share their remarks with me. So it's a pleasure to be here today. It's a pleasure to be able to present an aspect of my current research project on early modern jugglers, let's say street performers. So the provisional title of the book I'm writing is Jugglers, an Intellectual History of Street Performers from 1500s to the 1700s. From 1500 to 1700. So I use the word jugglers in its early modern sense when it designated a variety of street and court performers, so conjurers, acrobats, tightrope walkers, fire eaters, animal trainers, ventriloquists, charlatans, mountebanks, etc. So not just people throwing balls in the air. So the aim of the project is to show that the seemingly marginal and marginalized figure of the itinerant street performer occupied an important place in crucial philosophical, theological, and scientific debates of the early modern period. Jugglers and their prodigious feats were a sustained object of curiosity and reflection for early modern European intellectuals. They allowed them to think in novel ways about illusion, about imposture, about the boundaries between the natural and the supernatural, between the real and the virtual, between the true and the false. Jugglers' performances at court, in fairs, or in the marketplace were described and discussed in a remarkably broad range of genres: travel literature, chronicles, diaries, writings on the devil and witchcraft, works of religious polemic, books of secrets, how-to manuals, treatises of natural magic, medical and natural philosophical treatises, etc. So this is the corpus I explore from an intellectual history perspective, but my research also leads me to examine aspects of the social and cultural history of itinerant performers. And in particular, I'm interested in the border crossing itineraries of jugglers and in what they can tell us about the geography of early modern exchanges, cultural exchanges across Europe, but also between East and West, with Venice and Constantinople, or Istanbul, as nodal points of this dynamic map of the juggler's world. So I'm going to start to share my PowerPoint, and I think it's going to work. Yeah, it's working, right? Okay. So at the core of my paper today is the Venetian tradition of the volo or svolo del Turco, so the Turks' flight. This acrobatic feat was in the early modern period a highlight of the festivities of the Venetian carnival, among many other rites and entertainments such as bullfights, dances, masquerades, pageants, jousts, regattas, firework displays, etc. And more specifically, il volo del Turco was an essential component of the celebrations of the Giovedì Grasso, or Fat Thursday, so the Thursday that commenced the last week of Carnival, 1 week then before the start of Lent. The Giovedì Grasso was the climax of the Venetian Carnival. The civic ritual staged on that day, year after year, celebrated an ancient military victory over the patriarch Ulrich of Aquileia in the 12th century, when the Venetian fleets freed the town of Grado in Friuli, next to Aquileia, which had been attacked by Ulrich. And for nearly 3 centuries, Aquileia had to send a tribute of 1 bull and 12 pigs that were ritually and quite farcically decapitated in St. Mark's Piazza on the day of the Giovedì Grasso. And from 1521, only 1 bull and no pigs, so just 1 bull was slaughtered and no pigs. So this marked the start of the festivities. And the next show was the Volo del Turco. That you should see if I click here. Yeah. So this is Gabriele Bella's. Yes, I cannot see the. Okay, I don't have the full picture anyway. So this is Gabriele Bella's late 18th century representation of the Fat Thursday celebrations. So we see the Piazzetta. We have the Doge's Palace, so the Palazzo Ducale on the left-hand side. We have the Marciana Library on the right-hand side, and between the 2 buildings, we have the Macchina, so a large temporary construction which was erected in Piazzetta San Marco to host an orchestra, and from where the fireworks, which closed the festivities of the Giovedì Grasso, were let off. So the painting shows the ritual acrobatic demonstration of the, sorry, I forgot to start my clock. Okay, that is done. So the painting shows the ritual acrobatic demonstration of the Forze d'Hercule, so the human pyramids which followed the Volo. But we also see the Volo. We can see 2 ropes, one strung from the belfry of St. Mark's in Campanile to the canal, and the other from the belfry to the Doge's Palace. And we see a small acrobat. I don't know if you can see my pointer there. Okay, so we see a small acrobat harnessed to the rope, who's gliding towards the Doge, who's standing just below the balcony. And he's gliding with a gift in hand and probably a bunch of flowers. We have 2 earlier 18th century paintings on which Bella's painting is based. And we again see the ropes used for the Volo, but without the acrobat this time. So the left image is Francesco Guardi and the right is Giovanni Battista Brustoloni. So it seems that in the 17th and 18th centuries, the acrobat was harnessed to the, was attached to the ropes and was gliding thanks to rings and pulleys, and did then simply slide up and down, at least until a series of deadly accidents in the 1750s led Venetian authorities to replace the acrobat with a large wooden dove. The Volo del Turco then became known as the Volo della Colombina, and this tradition still exists today, but for the past 20 years, the wooden dove has been replaced by a young woman who slides down, safely attached to the wire, from the bell tower to the piazzetta with wings fastened to her back. So why was it originally named Il Volo del Turco, the Turks flight? Because the first acrobat to have performed this stunt in the mid-16th century was a Turkish tightrope walker who ascended on the rope from a platform on the lagoon up to the belfry of St. Mark's Campanile. So this fact is well known. It appears on every website on the Venetian Carnival, but the evidence for it is scarce. To my knowledge, the first historian to have mentioned this inaugural performance and to date it was Luigi Roffare in his 1931 study on sport in Venice, so La Repubblica di Venezia e lo Sport. So when he says that it seems that this exercise started in 1548, and he mentions this Turk who was ascended to the top of the tower with a long balancing pole. Roffare, however, did not provide his source for this claim, and the 19th century studies on Venetian civic and festive rituals he most certainly used, Justina Renier-Michiel, Giuseppe Tassini, do not mention these details, and nor do the 17th and 18th century sources quoted by these authors, by these works, or by later historical studies. I mean, very often later historical studies actually just repeat Rofare's claim and don't necessarily quote early modern sources. So these early modern sources, these are the ones I've been able to gather. I mean, these early modern sources give accounts of later flights. So flights in 1680, 1681, 1720, 1759, but they do not indicate that the Turkish acrobat was the first to perform the stunt in the mid-16th century. The information doesn't come from these sources. The Volo del Turco in these accounts is said to be performed by Venetian daredevils and Cristoforo Ivanovic. So the second item you have on the list, in particular mentions the feats of a Venetian gondolier named Santo da Calezze, who in 1680 climbed to the summit of the bell tower on a horse. Probably a fake one. I haven't been able to determine for sure whether it was a real horse or a fake one. But they are, I mean, yeah, we'll come back to that later. And later studies on the carnival have tended to repeat Rofare's claim, but without citing any early modern published or archival source mentioning the first flight, or without mentioning the contribution of Turkish performers to the Giovi di Grasso festivities. Among the sources, we have a brief reference in Tommaso Garzoni's Piazza Universale di tutte le professioni del mondo, so in 1585, where he mentions a Turkish tightrope walker who, among other feats, climbed, he says, to the summit of the Campanile. But the event is not dated, and actually, as we'll see later, well, I think it probably refers to a later performance, not the original one, and a performance that didn't have any link to the Giovi di Grasso festivities. So another feat, another performance in a different context. The document, which has allowed historians to date the first Volo del Turco, starting with Rofare, even if he doesn't mention the source, is actually an iconographical source. Beautiful woodcut. This is actually an early, this is an early 19th century print held at the Museo Correr, which reproduces a lost 16th century woodcut. So on this image, we see a tightrope walker with a long balancing pole making his ascension to St. Mark's bell tower. The performance is witnessed by a mass of spectators on the piazzetta and at the windows and under the porticos of the Doge's palace. So it's difficult to say with certainty whether the rope dancer wears a turban, but it seems so, and his three assistants, who are in charge of checking the tension of the rope on the canal, do clearly wear, as we can see, Ottoman robes and turbans. Art historians from the late 1920s have dated the woodcut and the scene to the late 1540s, using as evidence the coat of arms of the Doge Francesco Donna that appears on the image, was Doge from 1545 to 1553, and using the architectural details of Jacopo Sansovino's Marciana library on the left, which was built between 1537 and 1588, and is still under construction. So we can see at which stage of construction is the library on the picture. So this has allowed historians to date the picture and the scene to the late 1540s. And to my knowledge, this image is the only evidence used by historians so far to attest that a Turkish performer did initiate the tradition of the Volo del Turco in the late 1540s. There is, however, another source, a contemporary written source, which allows to confirm that the stunt did indeed take place, and that it took place actually in 1547, not 1548 as previously thought. And this overlooked source is the travelogue of the French traveler Jean Chénault, secretary of the French ambassador Gabriele Bella, who left a manuscript account of the voyage he made to Constantinople between 1547 and 1555. And that's the Voyage de Paris en Constantinople, which has been very recently published by Lisa Bushmalik in 2019. So Chénault and his companions stayed in Venice for most of February 1547 during the carnival season. During the carnival season, before embarking for Constantinople at the end of the month. And before closing his brief account of Venice, Chénaud offers an anecdote that serves as a perfect transition towards Constantinople and its many wonders. So he writes that he saw during the carnival a Turk, a Turc. He saw him climb on the rope with a balancing pole to the belfry of the Campanile, starting from the San Marco basin, so what we see actually in the engraving, so it starts from the waters, and that the acrobat returned to his point of departure, attached to the rope by his hair, gliding on the rope with his arms outstretched. Okay. So when he reached the very summit of the tower, he was tied with his hair to the rope, and hanging from it, he slowly glided down, still clapping his hands all the way down to the place he had departed. So note that the peculiar use that the rope walker makes of his hair is actually mentioned by several other travelers, including Chénaud, when describing similar stunts performed in Istanbul. So the Ottoman acrobats would indeed attach their long tuft of hair to a pulley sliding down the rope. Also note that according to Chénaud, the acrobat did not descend to the Doge's balcony. On the Doge's balcony, he just went back and forth to the summit and then back to the waters. And this is something that also corresponds to what we have in the engraving. Another fact that has gone largely unnoticed is that in the late 1540s and in the early 1550s, and then a bit later in the mid-1560s, so roughly over a period of 20 years, a series of very similar stunts were performed in several Italian cities by Ottoman rope dancers. And it's very likely that several of these feats, at least the earlier ones, were accomplished by the same acrobat, or the same group of acrobats, led by the same acrobats. And that this person is actually the Turkish funambulist mentioned by Chénaud, and the funambulist who appears on the Museo Correr engraving. So these are the dates and places I have been able to gather from a variety of manuscript and printed sources. So from chronicles, from diaries and letters, from printed works on magic and witchcraft. So if I can't see very clearly my PowerPoint thing. Okay, sorry. Back to, okay. So the first event is the one I discussed, the one in February 1547 for the Giovedì Grasso in Venice. And the source, most pertinent source being Jean Chénaud, Le Voyage de Paris en Constantinople. The second one, Florence, a couple of months later, May, July 1547, and Rome, either in 1548 or 1549. I haven't been able to determine with more precision the event. Then Florence, again in February 1549, then Milan, 1552, Urbino, 1555, Bologna, 1560, around those dates, between 1561 and 64, and Venice again on May 1564, outside the context of the Venetian Carnival. I think it's to this event that Garzoni thinks when he mentions a Turkish performer. So there are certainly more examples hiding in the archives, but this is enough, I think, to show that there was a strong presence of Ottoman acrobats performing and touring in the northern half of Italy in the mid-16th century, touring outside Venice and in different contexts than the Fat Thursday civic ritual. And altogether, these accounts form a rich and overlooked source for the history of the performing arts, the social and cultural history of street and court performers, and the history of cultural exchanges between Europe and the Ottoman Empire. Almost all of the, all but one of the performances listed here include the ascent by the tightrope walker to the top of a huge civic or religious building in the heart of the city, and thus in front of a huge and a mixed crowd. In Venice, the ascent is made to the top of St. Mark's Bell Tower. In Florence, to the top of the tower of the Palazzo Vecchio. In Rome, to the top of the campanile of St. Peter's Basilica. In Milan, the top of one of the towers of the Castello Sforzesco. Bologna, a Corsi tower of the Palazzo d'Accursio. So always the same kind of stunt. And this kind of acrobatic feat was characteristic of Ottoman tightrope walkers, as evidenced by many early modern European travel accounts to the Ottoman Empire, or by Ottoman Britain and iconographic sources. And I'll say more about these sources later, hoping that I have enough time. There are other similarities. I mean, the same is true for the use of props such as swords, weights, basins, stilts, which are mentioned in several of the accounts listed here, and which are again characteristic of the performances of Ottoman acrobats. Also, feats such as quickly sliding down the rope attached with the arms outstretched as if flying, which is mentioned in several sources. We have the same in Florence, in Rome, in Milan. We have it mentioned in Ottoman sources as well, or the feat of attaching oneself to the rope by the hair, as we've seen, or other juggling feats of strength, which were commonly practiced by the Ottoman zorbas. Sorry, I mean, I don't know how to pronounce Turks, so I'm doing my best. So if someone wants to correct my pronunciation later, I'm happy to be corrected. So the zorbas were jugglers performing feats of bodily strength, for instance, smashing ox bones with the arms or legs, or juggling with heavy pieces of timber, or lying down with an anvil on the chest, being brutally hammered by assistants. All these things are mentioned in those sources and listed here, and we find them again when in sources dealing with Ottoman performers at home. So all the sources listed here clearly identify the performers as Turks. It is true, as David Gentlecore has noted, that early modern European street performers, in particular charlatans, commonly adopted exotic names and identities. Part of the charlatan's attraction to the public, writes Gentlecore, so part of the charlatan's attraction to the public lay in their exoticism, or at least the fiction of exoticism, in which the public willingly participated. So, end of quote. And Gentlecore lists, for example, charlatans known as il barbaresco, il levantino, il persiano, il turchetto, and who, despite their very exotic stage names, were all born and bred in Italy. And it's also true that when tightrope walkers and acrobats are registered as Turks elsewhere in Europe, like in England in the late 16th century, we have records of payments around 1590, payments made in Norwich, Ipswich, and Bristol that mention Turkish acrobats. It's difficult to know for sure whether these performers were indeed Turks, or whether they were English or Italian acrobats passing as Turks in order to benefit from the prestige of Turkish tightrope walkers, because at the end of the 16th century, their reputation as world-class acrobats, superior to all other nations, was indeed firmly established. So all this is true. However, the close similarities between the performances listed here and those of contemporary Ottoman acrobats suggest that these performers were indeed of Ottoman origin. And there are other elements that support this. For instance, if I come back to the Florentine Chronicles, so Diario del Quindici di Marcelli. The Florentine diarist, for instance, indicates that one of the Duke of Medici's footmen, a converted Turk named Cristofano, acted as some kind of go-between and maybe translator between the rope dancers and the Duke. So we have this presence of a Turkish man acting as go-between. And the same chronicler also clearly distinguishes between this Turkish juggler, this Turco giocolatore that he talks about, and other jugglers, other rope dancers who performs in Florence in the very same years, who are not Turkish. So he talks about another giocolatore, but not a Turco giocolatore, who did wonderful things too, but he says lacked the grace and the manner of the Turk. To use another source, Girolamo Cardano, so in his account of the tightrope performance in Milan, also notes that one of the Turkish performers subsequently converted to Christianity and took the name Ferrandus. So we have something that, in a sense, strengthens the idea that this was indeed a Turkish performer because he converted to Christianity and took the name Ferrandus, which was the name of the then governor of Milan, Ferrante Gonzaga. So I think there's good reason to believe that they are indeed Ottoman performers. And well, what these accounts don't tell us, however, is whether these acrobats were recent arrivals who had come to Italy specifically to perform and started performing as soon as they came, or if they had already spent several years living in Italy somewhere. We also don't know if they went back home after a few years, but I don't know. If they traveled back and forth between East and West, or if they remained more permanently in Europe. And Ferrando's conversion to Christianity seems to suggest that some chose to stay in Europe. What is apparent, though, is that these men were itinerant performers who went from one Italian state to the other to display their skills, and that in doing so, some of them found fame and fortune. There is indeed, that's the 15, okay, yeah, I'll mention this in a moment. So there is indeed every reason to believe that the rope dancer who was present with his assistants in Venice in February 1547, so the original flight, is the same who appeared, so I'm coming back just to make it clearer. So is the same who appeared 3 months later in Florence. In Florence, he crossed the Arno on a rope in front of a considerable crowd. So the chronicler talks about 20,000 people. He climbed to the top of the Palazzo Vecchio, and he was then invited by the Duke Cosimo de' Medici, thanks to the intercession of Cristofano, the convert. So he was invited to perform for the Duke in the palace. And with the Duke's authorization, the Turco Giocolatore then showed his skills to a paying audience in the cloister of Santa Maria Novella, where he disturbed, we know, a session of the Accademia Fiorentina. They went very pleased with this. So 2 months late, and 2 months later in July, so the same chronicler tells us that 2 months later in July, he left for Rome, having received 300 scudi from the Duke and 6 rich Medicean tapestries. In 1545, Cosimo had just inaugurated 2 ducal tapestry ateliers in Florence. So this is quite a handsome gift. And this rope dancer is very likely to be the one who performs then in 1548, probably, or 1549 in Rome, so in St. Peter's Square and in the palace of the Duke of Ferrara, Ippolito II, Ippolito d'Este. If so, if it's truly the one, but it seems likely, his stay in Rome must have been very lucrative. Indeed, according to the Florentine chronicler, when the same Turk, he talks about il medesimo turco, so when the same Turk, the first one, came back to Florence 2 years later, in February 1549, he had himself, the Turkish performer had himself a lavish gift for the Duke. He gave to the Duke 5 Turkish horses. So this was not your average street performer. This was a celebrity. It was the early modern equivalent of a Las Vegas performer. So the account of his 1549 performance, so the second one in Florence, this time in Piazza Santa Croce, is one of the richest and most detailed descriptions of a rope dancing act I have come across. So I won't detail it here. It covers 3 or 4 pages. But this act was in any case extraordinary enough to earn the acrobat another very generous gift from the Duke. And this time he earned 8 Medicean tapestries, so 8 bellissimi panni d'arazzi. And we have other evidence showing that these Ottoman rope dancers were handsomely rewarded for their performances. We know that from an archival source, we know that the acrobat who performed on the 23rd of May 1564, so this is it, on the occasion of the festivities organized for the Duke of Urbino and his son. So this acrobat was paid a sum of 100 Venetian ducats, so which corresponds actually to the entire budget of the festivities of the Giovedì Grasso in 1550. And this is Gravenbroich illustration of the 1564 performance. So we don't know whether our rich and famous acrobat after Venice, after Florence and Rome, went afterwards to Milan, Urbino, or he went directly to Las Vegas, but we don't know if there were several troops of Turkish acrobats touring in Italy at the same time, in the late 1540s, early 1550s. but we might be able to give to this performer a name and a face. The Museo of the humanist Paolo Giovio, which is a collection of 400 portraits of illustrious men, including 11 Ottoman sultans, comprises indeed an anonymous portrait painted in Rome in 1547. So when the performer is performing in Florence, in Venice and then Florence. So the portrait is now at the Pinacoteca Civica in Como, and it represents one Ali Turco, presented on the painting as Alice Turca stupendae agilitatis funambulus, and it's dated Rome, Romae 1547. So this supremely agile funambulus is dressed with the pomp and magnificence of an Ottoman sultan, to the point that the painting was actually presented by some 16th century authors as a portrait of the Sultan Mehmed I. And the balancing pole that he seems to be holding in his hand was mistaken for a sword. So let's go back to Venice and the 1547 Giove di Grasso. So there is something puzzling about the presence of an Ottoman performer at the very heart of a celebration of Venetian military power, and moreover, at the top of one of the greatest churches of Christendom. And the same could be said about the 1564 festivities in Venice, when a Turkish acrobat was hired to perform the same feats, climbing at the top of the bell tower, as the highlight of the celebrations in the honor of the Duke of Urbino, Guidobaldo II, who was at the time the military leader of the Republic of Venice, Governatore, and was Captain General of the Church, Capitano Generale della Chiesa. So confronted with this seeming incongruity, historians have generally seen it as a way for the Venetian Republic to express its domination of the Ottomans and symbolically humiliate them by making the Turkish juggler walk on a thin rope in a very precarious position. So in the same way that the bull decapitated on the Giove di Grasso represented the defeated patriarch of Aquileia, the juggler, balancing between the sea and the skies, would represent the weakness and vulnerability of the Ottoman Empire. So this is an interpretation offered by Trinity Kennedy in a note for the catalogue accompanying the exhibition Venice and the Islamic World. So the catalogue included, and the exhibition included the engraving of the first Volo del Turco, which I've shown before. And so she writes, by hiring a Turk to perform as an acrobat, Venetians appear to have been declaring their sense of moral superiority over the Ottomans as a people. Adding another layer of meaning, the author of the print depicts the Turkish tightrope walker as he reached the halfway point between the Piazzetta's columns of justice, the place where criminals were subjected to public ridicule and executed. In the playful and uninhibited atmosphere of carnival, Venetians expressed their ambivalence about their Muslim neighbors and trading partners through this spectacle. This interpretation is taken up by Erith Jaffeberg, in particular in her 2015 monograph, Commedia dell'arte and the Mediterranean. And she writes, while the Ottoman Turks were able rivals to the Venetians, the subjection of the symbolic Turk, so she talks about the symbolic Turk because she has doubts about whether it's a real Turk or a Venetian dressed up as a Turk. So the subjection of the symbolic Turk to perils may have had a collective function of projecting Venetian wishes for domination and power over the rivals to the east. So the foreign rope dancer in this perspective is deprived of his agency. I mean, far from being an agent of cultural exchange and an ambassador for Ottoman arts, he appears as a pawn employed to perform a political ritual that ultimately intends to humiliate him and the Ottoman Empire he stands for. I think I've got the printer issue, so I have to find my Word file, otherwise I won't be able to read the rest of my notes. So just give me a second. Okay, so the printer has done strange things with right. Up. Okay. So are you still? Okay, so I closed the shared thing apparently. So okay, so I'm going to share again, and I hope they'll be able to access my document at the same time. Okay, so can you see the PowerPoint? Yeah. Okay. Okay, and I can see my notes. Right. Okay. So what was it? Okay. So now that we know more about the circumstances of the original Volo del Turco, and that we know more about the wider context of the acrobatic shows performed by Ali Turco and his peers in mid-16th century Italy, I believe there's reason to nuance this interpretation, the one offered by Edith Jeffberg and Ginta Kennedy. Indeed, I would argue that in view of an image of vulnerability, to quote a word used by Jeffberg, these acrobatic performances displayed actually an image of power. And all the accounts I have gathered express the same feelings on the part of the spectators: utter wonder and amazement, and a profound admiration for the bravery, the dexterity, the skill, the strength of the performers. The acrobats are repeatedly presented as superhuman beings, able to fly like birds. So the comparisons between rope dancing and flying and the flight of birds abound in the accounts. And therefore, they're able to transgress the boundaries. I mean, they appear able to transgress the boundaries between natural worlds and to blur the boundary between the natural and the supernatural. So fear is also present. But when the acrobat seems to fall or to be in peril, it's an intentional trick meant to provoke laughter. So the acrobat plays at will with death and with the audience's feelings. Ultimately, the rope dancer appears to walk in the air as safely, sicuro, as the accounts say, as safely and confidently as he were walking on the ground. Besides, the elevated position of the rope dancer also conveyed a sense of power. In all these instances, the acrobat physically and symbolically dominates the city. He walks over the roofs, he walks over rivers, he occupies cloisters and piazzas, and he sets foot on the top of buildings, which were the most eloquent architectural expressions of religious and civic power, and this with the blessing of local political authorities. So it's the Ottoman subject who seems to be conquering and dominating the European world. And the fact that several of these performances took place during periods of carnival might help to make sense of this inversion of expected roles. Moreover, nothing suggests that these rope dancers were socially vulnerable. They apparently managed to circulate between cities and courtly circles. They were hired, greeted, and very generously rewarded by prominent political figures. And some of them, such as Ali Turco, even seem to have reached a position of fame and fortune. So in the early modern period, street and performers were not necessarily marginalized and despised figures. So instead of cementing a picture of Venetian domination over the Mediterranean, so I'm quoting Jeffberg again, the performance of Ottoman rope dancers seem to have cemented instead a picture of the superiority of Ottoman acrobatics, and more broadly of Ottoman strength, dexterity, and bravery. So see the following remark. Okay, so I haven't mentioned this, but we can come back to that. A remark from Pierre Leloyer in his Traité des Spectres, so Treatise of Spectres in 1605. So Pierre Leloyer is a demonologist who had read travel accounts about Turkish rope dancers, and he saw them as the heirs of the funambulists of antiquity. And he writes, the report is that the Turkish tumblers are far more subtle, not how to pronounce it, and artificial than the Italians. For be it either to tumble, to dance upon a cord, or by force and strength of the arms, to bear and lift up things of huge weight, such as the Italians are not able so much as to lift from the ground, they are held to be the most expert and excellent. And this was, after all, the very purpose of the acrobatic demonstrations held in Constantinople during festivities such as those organized by the sultans to celebrate imperial weddings of circumcisions. The most expensive and grandiose of these festivities was the Imperial Festival of 1582, which celebrated the circumcision of the son of Sultan Murad III. The festival lasted for over 50 days and 50 nights and was attended by a great number of foreign envoys. These 1582 festivities are well documented. We find detailed descriptions in a dozen European travel accounts, as well as in imperially commissioned festival books, such as, again, I apologize for my Turkish, as the illustrated Sorname-i Humayun, so the book of the imperial festivities. So the images I have here are drawn from these sources, as well as from later festival books documenting 17th and 18th century wedding and circumcision festivals. So I don't have time to discuss these images in more detail of the 1582 festival, but what we gather from these sources is that Ottoman acrobats and tightrope walkers formed an important and respected guild, that they were from very diverse origins, gypsies, Egyptians, Arabs, Persians, Indians, and that their performances were one of the highlights of the festival. The overall aim of the festival was to recreate the Ottoman world on stage, I'm quoting an historian, and by doing so, the aim was to impress foreign dignitaries while distracting the population from domestic troubles. The shows performed by acrobats and rope dancers were indeed meant to demonstrate the exceptional strength, bravery, and skill of the Sultan's subjects. Like the Forze d'Ercole, like the sword dances, like the regattas and the bullfights held during the Venetian Carnival, these acrobatic shows were an instrument of soft power. So one could therefore argue that when performing in Italy and elsewhere in Europe, instead of being manipulated, so to speak, into serving Venetian interest, our Ottoman rope dancers were actually instruments of this Ottoman soft power, reaching new audiences. And maybe this explains why the Venetian authorities eventually replaced the Turkish acrobats with local sailors and gondoliers. I come to the conclusion. So, more than the expression of the conflictual relationship between Venice and the Ottoman Empire, I would be tempted to see in the Volo del Turco and in other instances of Turkish acrobatic performances in Italy, a case of cultural mediation carried out by non-elite intermediaries. The example of Ali Turco and his companions makes, I think, a case, even if it's a modest one, but makes a case for the fluidity and porosity of cultural boundaries between Islam and Christianity in the mid-16th century, and more broadly for the role that early modern jugglers might have played as agents of cultural exchange. In his 2006 study on Venetians in Constantinople, Eric Dostela remarked that one of the striking, but often, so I'm quoting, one of the striking but often overlooked features of Veneto-Ottoman relations in the early modern period is the degree to which the two powers' relations were characterized by coexistence rather than conflict. So in line with these remarks, I would offer here to see the rope of the Ottoman rope dancer as a bridge between two cultures, as a sign of coexistence. It's a bit cheesy, but well, as a bridge between two cultures, a sign of coexistence, rather than as an expression of weakness and political conflict. Thank you.